listening to Mr. Radio, and I'm your host, Marshall. Today's guest is a former mentor at SUNY Empire State College, a longtime member of the Sarah Lawrence College Writing Institute faculty, as well as a longtime freelancer. His work has been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Christian Science Monitor, as well as the LA Times and other publications. He is also the Senior Editor, Literary Ombudsman for the spoken word venue, Read 650. In his 50-plus years as a writer, he has published 4 novels, 4 nonfiction books, 3 poetry collections, and 3 poetry chapbooks. Among his titles are Zen and the Art of Fatherhood, Fear and Loathing of Boca Raton, If I Die Before You Wake, and 3 recent novels, Take This, Loving Violet, and A Hard Rain. His most recent books include a novel, The Lights Around the Shore and Fire in Paradise, a poetry collection co-authored with Elizabeth Bayou Grace. He is currently at work on a series of 3 novellas and is anxious to find out how they're connected. It is my pleasure to introduce Stephen Lewis to the show. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Hi, Marshall.
You know, I hate flying, but on a recent 3,000-mile flight to California, I finished reading your recent book, The Lights Around the Shore, and it was the most pleasant flight that I've had in a long time, and I'm serious about that.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're my best friend now.
But, you know, your book reminded me of Travels with Charlie in Search of America, which was written by John Steinbeck in 1961, only the roles are reversed. In your book, Charlie is driving the car. How did you come up with the character of Charlie Messina?
You know, I don't come up with anything. I know that sounds a little glib or maybe a little fake, but I just sit down in front of the screen and start writing, and very quickly a character shows up. And I have written about a grumpy old man several times, so that must be something I'm particularly intrigued about, and I'm growing into, by the way.
You know, you mentioned that he's a grumpy old man, and I was reading reviews that other people had of the book, and they all mentioned grumpy old man, but I didn't see him as a grumpy old man. I could really relate to him, and unless I'm grumpy and I don't know it.
No, actually, I agree. I sort of use that just as a way to throw out a big characterization, but I don't see him as grumpy at all, and I really like him. On the other hand, I have to admit, you know, full disclosure here, my wife thinks he's a horrible human being.
But does she think he's grumpy?
Yes, she thinks he's grumpy.
All right. Well, I guess we're both grumpy and we don't know it.
That's right. That's quite possible.
Now, you say you just sit in front of the screen and come up with the characters, but I found out that you owned dogs named Jane, Meldog Lewis, Gloria, and Plumpy. Did these dogs help you in creating the characters of Bad Breath and Dumbass, or this just came up as you were sitting in front of the screen?
No, actually, for a long time, this may be more than you want, but for a long time, I wrote commercially and for magazines and newspapers and stuff. And at some point, I grew weary of writing what I knew and began to write into what I don't know, to really essentially to find out what was going on inside. And the first time I did that was with the novel Take This, where I was online in a convenience store down on Hatteras Island, North Carolina, and I heard someone say, "Take this." And I thought, oh my God, isn't that interesting? That's sort of what the universe does to all of us. And I went and I sat down and I immediately came upon a scene where the first grumpy old man opens the door and his ex-wife is handing him her engagement ring in prelude to the divorce. And she says, "Take this."
Uh-huh.
So that was sort of interesting just to start. And from that point on, every word, every paragraph, just sort of, I allowed them out. And I tried not to interfere with the story that was unfolding. There was a lot of editing work to be done after I got through the entire book, but each time I thought I came to a sort of a cliff, the story would write itself. Anyway, it's an exhilarating way to write, and it's the way that I wrote this last one.
But still, I felt that your description of the way the dogs act and behave, you had to own a dog in order to be able to describe what's going on.
No, absolutely. I mean, my wife and I have had dogs up until very recently when Plumpy passed away, for more than 50 years. There's never been a time, and living with a dog, and living with children are somewhat similar. You see how they respond to you, and in some ways, the dog is the best traveling companion you could possibly have.
I'd like to ask you a question about something else. In both books that I read, Fear and Loathing of Boca Raton, A Hippie's Guide to the Second 60s, and the one we're discussing now, The Lights Around the Shore, I noticed interesting chapter titles. What goes into your chapter title selection process?
In Fear and Loathing of Boca Raton, which was intended as a more commercial book, I looked for, and the publisher looked for, enticing titles that would grab a reader's attention and make them buy the book. In Lights Around the Shore, the titles were really geographic. They're intended to, since I was playing with time and space throughout that whole book, it was sort of putting people in the correct time and geography so that they were able to get sort of immersed in the story, or maybe even lost in the story as it went along. So it was two very different things. But like I was saying before, that my writing life took a turn maybe 15 years ago into each book being an unplanned journey.
I'm interested in your saying unplanned journey. You were talking about this when you're looking at the screen and things just come up. But there's certain things that I'm really curious how you go about doing. For example, you're describing your experiences driving the stick shift car, and more importantly, one thing that really struck me, and I don't mean this to be a pun here, you take something as mundane as preparing a lucky strike for a smoke. How do you go about turning something mundane like that into something that I thought was kind of extraordinary?
Oh, thank you. Because, in writing the way that I try to write, the present moment, the moment that I'm writing about, becomes more important almost than anything around it. That the ways that he would take his lucky strike, and I drew that directly out of my own experience. For far too many years, I smoked lucky strikes, and there was something almost sacramental about the way that you opened it, that way that I opened up a pack and got the cigarette ready. And part of that, again, more unintentional than anything, is to put the reader in the moment, to get a real visceral sense of where Charlie is at any given time. And if I could do that, then I have somehow caught the reader's attention deeply enough to have that person come along with me into an unknown territory. I don't know if that makes sense, but
unfortunately, because people aren't smoking as much these days, I don't know if people can appreciate what goes into tapping down a cigarette pack and getting it all ready for just
Right.
one cigarette. But it was illustrated very well in your descriptions there.
Well, that's wonderful. That's my heart good to hear that.
You know,
Yeah, I actually don't think we necessarily have to know the experience in order to experience it. I think really good writing, or I mean, since you do a lot with music, I can listen to really old blues people, and I get a sense of a real sense, a deep sense of who they are and what their lives are all about. And I'm about as far from an early blues man that you can get.
Well, I'm surprised that you say that, because I noticed that you have an interest rather in music that makes its way into your writing. For example, you referenced Dylan's "I Dreamed I Saw St. Augustine," which comes up again in the selection from this book, which I asked you to read for us. Would you care to introduce this selection for us?
Well, Charlie is has had a cardiac event and falls into a coma, and when he wakes up, 48 hours later or months later, and that's the whole deal here. Is it's how long was he in a coma, and what was he thinking while he was in a coma or experiencing? Nevertheless, when he wakes up, he sees his wife and his grown sons, and tells them that he quotes the line from Dylan's "I saw St. Augustine live as you or me," and he also saw his dead daughter and a dog that shows up throughout the rest of the book.
Let's take a listen to you reading that selection for us.
Great.
"So," Dylan whispers again, eyes flooding, pausing, then glancing through the window at the sparkling green yard. "So, what did St. Augustine say to you?" "He didn't say anything. Mom's right. I don't even believe in God. In fact, it didn't seem like he even noticed me. Maybe it wasn't St. Augustine, just some drugged-out bum in Rome's. Anyway, I thought he was St. Augustine, and he was just standing there next to Joni. I'm sure it was her. Then some dog came up to them." "Dog? Bad breath?" "He's dead too, Dad." "They're all dead, Dylan. All three. Augustine, Joni, the breath. This dog was nothing like the breath, except he was fat." "Just some random dog?" "Yeah, you know, kind of an overweight block-headed mutt. Black, thick tail, wagging, like an obese lab. Do you remember Dizzy Gillespie, the black lad we had when you were little?" Dylan nods. "Like him, but different. Fat. And the three of them were standing in line at a lobster roll stand on the Cape." "I don't know what to say, Dad. Sounds a little far out to me." "I'm not saying it isn't, but I'm not making it up. And as far as I can tell, I'm not crazy." "So," Dylan continues, "what do you think it means?" He looks away toward the marsh. Charlie takes his hand off Dylan's knee and stands up straight. "You see something?" A brisk shake, and then a clipped no, but Charlie knows Dylan did. Moments later, after the air in the studio has gone still, the two of them breathless, Charlie murmurs, "And then, wouldn't you know it, the damn mutt showed up at the back door yesterday." Turning his head from side to side, then quickly glancing back toward the kitchen, Dylan whispers, "Dog? Where's the dog?" "I guess you can't see it." "I can't see it." "Right. You can't see it. But I'm not crazy, son. I'm just finding out that once you step through a veil, you can see things that were hidden in all those gauzy layers that keep us cocooned. Things that were always there but just never noticed, You know what I mean? Yeah. No. I guess. Dylan scans the studio and stares out through the window into the marsh. You do know I can't see a dog. Yes, Dylan. So where is it? Right here, Charlie says, pointing to the side of his shoe. And now you're looking at me like you're really afraid I'm crazy. Dylan's flat smile grows toothy. Well, you're right. I am definitely afraid that you're crazy. Batshit Looney Tunes, if you really want to know. He presses his lips together, then adds, but I have to say that I almost kind of like it. After the last how many years? Batshit Looney Tunes would be a relief.
That was a selection from The Lights Around the Shore by Stephen Lewis, read by my guest, Stephen Lewis. I have another question, but I hope I get it right, okay? You can correct me if I'm wrong here. Towards the end of your book, you seem to shift your writing from writing in the third person perspective to the second person point of view. Am I correct in that?
Absolutely.
What made you approach the story in this way?
I originally I started writing the first draft in the usual third person past tense. And then because the book quickly evolved into something about parallel time and moving from one time period to another and having some time periods overlap, I got increasingly interested in, first of all, in the subject, and then how to present that. And so it actually wasn't just at the end that the piece shifts. The book has something like 6 sections. There's some of it that's written past tense, first person past tense, second person past tense, and third person past tense. And the same thing with present tense. There's no future, so I guess I was right about 6. Anyway, there are 6 parallel overlapping scenes that go back to give that sense that not just deja vu, but things that are happening now have already happened and will happen again in the future. And that sort of the bottom line is that we can, if we get across that threshold, we can experience every moment of our lives as if it's happening simultaneously.
When I got to that point in the book, it became like a Twilight Zone episode for me. It really, it was
Right.
very, very powerful, I thought.
Well, God, we need to have a drink together because you are officially my best friend.
Would it be a spoiler alert to explain your title choice for The Lights Around the Shore?
As with a fair amount of things in my writing life, I stumbled across that poem. That's all. And suddenly, it's like I could see myself, or I could see Charlie looking out and realizing that that poem, hearing that poem, thinking about that poem, that and that whole notion of parallel existence and parallel lives, it just fit. And it in a way, I may be going far afield here, but I think a lot about being in love or loving someone is that it's never a conscious decision. And when I think back at 54 years of marriage, you would look at my wife and I and say that we're almost unsuited for each other. And it turns out that we're, in a funny way, perfect for each other because of things about each other that don't fit. Anyway, I'm going far afield here, but that title came out of a poem that I stumbled upon and realized that it had something to tell me rather than me telling a reader something.
I didn't realize it was a poem. I discovered that it was almost like a ballad song, and when I heard the singing, then I looked at the cover of your book, and everything started to make sense in a different way. I, I was curious about the cover. Who designed your cover, and what went into that?
That's one a wonderful serendipity. I have a friend from high school, Marjorie Weiss, who's a painter, and I've only seen her probably 3 or 4 times in the last, since whenever I graduated high school in 1964. But I see her stuff online, and this particular painting, or digital painting, I think it really was, just struck me. And not only did it strike me, but since Dumbass, or Saris, the dog that came into the story, I could see him in that painting. A little bit of serendipity. But anyway, I called her up, asked her if we could use the painting, and another high school friend actually designed the cover for the publisher.
Speaking of high school, were you a gearhead as a teenager? You have a great way of describing how a stick shift car operates. So I was just curious if you had gearhead experiences in high school.
No, not really. I mean, I drove a stick shift, but it was no. I was pretty much an empty-headed high school kid. Played sports and saw my girlfriend, and that was pretty much my life. But it goes along with what we were talking about just before, about creating a moment. There's something about the actual physical act, the physical properties of anything that we do, that I'm not only interested in, but that draws a reader into a situation. If anything, if I have any intent, it's to stop a reader from thinking and being an observer and being part of whatever the scene is. And the scene comes from something very visceral.
I mentioned in the introduction that you also have 3 poetry chapbooks. For listeners who may not be familiar with chapbooks, can you explain them for us?
Yeah, a chapbook is like it's a short collection of poems. Usually they can range from like 16 pages to 32 pages, but many of them are like half a book of poems, and small poetry presses put them out, not only as a means of saving some money and all of that, but really it's almost the right format for reading poems. If you have 15 or 20 poems, that's a nice collection. You can go through and read it, and you can put it down, and you can come back to it. Some big poetry collections are almost overwhelming, and poems get lost. But the chapbook is just a short book. That's all, like a chapter.
Chapbook sounds to me like chat bots, and in addition to writing, you're also teaching. And
yep.
I was wondering if you could share any of your teaching experiences.
Sure.
And I'll get back to chatbot and how that relates to my question in a second.
All right. I've taught everything from 9th grade through graduate school, but probably the most important day, I think, in my teaching life was one day I was over in Poughkeepsie and over in Millbrook, New York, and teaching a bunch of high school seniors, and they all did absolutely miserably on a quiz that I had made up, and it was it was so disappointing because I realized they really hadn't heard anything I had to say. And then I went to my college class that night in New Paltz, and we were talking about some book, doesn't matter. And I realized that they also hadn't heard what I had said to class before, that they had their own ideas. And then I got home that night, and I got a call. I got a call from one of my kids' English teachers saying they hadn't been doing homework. So it was just one of those days, and I after a hard night, I realized that my job as an English teacher or a writing teacher was not to tell them what they needed to learn, but to listen to them, what they got, and then if I could, redirect the conversation. And so I began to think of myself more as a doorman, minus the epaulets and the stripe down the side of my pants, where I would invite students into the room, make sure they're comfortable, and then ask them what they thought. And it changed my life as a teacher tremendously. Not that there aren't ups and downs, but giving students the voice, or giving the students equal part in the discussion, first of all, especially with high school kids, made them do homework. They did the reading.
The way I want to weave chatbot into this is that now I'm finding out that they have these AI chatbots where a student can just tell the computer, okay, write me a story about an invisible dog. How can you deal with that as a teacher?
It's somehow in my mind aligned with what I was talking about before about love. That no matter how much these chatbots can do, they can never create the magic that a good writer does in a book, or a musician, or any artist of any kind. It's harder if you're asking to look at a student's essay about F. Scott Fitzgerald or something, but it's still missing the soulful expression that each student would have. I know they're creating programs to check these chatbots, but I don't think they could ever create a short story or a poem or a novel that would reflect the inner life of a person. I mean, something happens in the writing that's magical, and a computer can't do that.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time. However, I don't want to disappoint my listeners, and I asked some listeners to send in questions, and I want to fit this last question in, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Again, I asked readers to pose some questions for you, and one question is tied to a piece that you wrote about for spirituality and health, and it was titled Marked Man. And Rob from New York wanted to know more about your tattoos. Could you try to answer Rob's question?
I've always liked tattoos up to a certain point. And because I'm Jewish, I had this notion that this was something that one should never do. And whether it's true or not, it was like you couldn't get buried in a Jewish cemetery, which wouldn't interest me anyway. In any case, I got a small tattoo of Hatteras Island, which was sort of my sanctuary, and still is to a large degree, on my arm. And it was like, I felt it was like one of the more audacious things I had ever done. I had stepped over a line, and as soon as I left the studio in Woodstock, New York, I wanted to go back in and get another one. And that's been the experience. I probably have 10 tattoos on my arms, and they're each time is the same thing. There's something about decorating my body with things that are, or symbols, that images that are very meaningful to me, and they sort of live beyond me. That's all. There's just something wonderful about getting a tattoo, that I can understand that a lot of people wouldn't.
I hope that answers Rob's question.
I do
And
too, but
as I said, we're running out of time, but for readers who are listening to this, where can your books be found?
the usual places, Amazon, you can order them from bookstores. A lot of them are probably out of print just over the years, but you can almost always get it on Amazon. And just because I like independent bookstores more than Amazon, you can go and they can, a small bookstore can order anything that you want that's still available.
And do you have a website?
I do. DeepLewisWriter.com.
Very good.
And as long as I'm plugging myself, I do a poetry newsletter called PoemsFromTheCrag.com.
I will put all of those in the link to this show so that people can just click on it and get to it right away. Stephen Lewis, I'm so happy that you were able to take the time to speak with me, and I hope to hear from you again real soon.
Me too. Thank you, Marshall. Much appreciated.
You've been listening to Mr. Radio, and I'm your host, Marshall. This program was written and produced by Marshall. Our theme music was played by Ululation. Mr. Radio is available wherever you get your podcasts, including iTunes and Spotify. Subscribe to our podcast and leave us a review. And don't forget to tune in next week for another episode of Mr. Radio.